Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. I am Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and very happy to welcome you on this day. I think it's the first day of fall, September 21st, 2022. As I said, we are coming to the issue of broadband mapping, and it's a subject we've written about repeatedly here at Broadband Breakfast. Our motto is better broadband, better lives. We're all about reporting on and bringing together the people and institutions and communities that need access to broadband. And broadband data has kind of been part of our interest set and DNA for 15 years, since we started as Broadband Census in 2008. So it's kind of no surprise that we've had events on broadband mapping many times, including December of last year, February of this year, April of this year, June of this year, and again today. And I fully expect we'll have more sessions on this in coming months. In fact, I want to invite all of you who are attending today or watching to attend our special broadband mapping masterclass. Okay, this is going to happen on Tuesday at 12 noon Eastern time, and it's not our normal time for Broadband Breakfast Live Online is every Wednesday at 12 noon. We're doing a special paid event for $99. I will walk our attendees through the whole set of controversies around broadband mapping and broadband data. For example, we'll be talking about the fabric and the controversies around it. We'll be talking about other databases that are out there besides the FCC and Form 477. We'll talk about state maps and the role of state maps versus federal maps. We'll talk about measuring actual speeds and some of the controversies and discussions about that. And we'll talk about public challenges. Now, we'll certainly talk about some of those here today, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm glad everyone is here and participating, and we want to make sure you attend all of our free events at Broadband Breakfast Live Online. But we do want to encourage those of you who have a special interest in this to register for and join us. And information is available at broadbandbreakfast.com for all of this. I also want to give a shout out and a thanks to the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast. Without our sponsors, we would not be able to do the free programming we've done now for more than 2 years, 2.5 years. Every week, we're doing programming on Better Broadband, Better Lives. Those sponsors include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Lightbox, Ookla, Michael Baker International, Pinpoint Capital Advisors, Bitstream Communications, Inc., Geo Partners, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to each of our sponsors for your participation in our programming. So I think the last thing I want to mention is our panelists, right? And let's go ahead and open the view to everyone. Our panel today includes Brian Darr. Brian is a very important person at Ookla, which does speedtest.net. And I've been using it for years and years and years. And in fact, Brian is also a prior participant in Broadband Breakfast events. He is the vice president of smart communities at Ookla. And in that role, he coordinates Ookla, or speedtest.net, the company that runs speedtest.net is Ookla, coordinates Ookla's outreach to local, state, and federal governments and serves on CTIA, the Wireless Association's Smart Cities Business and Technology Working Group. Following Brian will be Scott Walston. Scott is the president and senior fellow, a nice combo there to have both those, at the Technology Policy Institute, as well as being a senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. And Scott and I go back really to the founding of before the founding of Broadband Census, because Scott and I were co-chairs on I think it was called the Metrics Working Group of the U.S. Broadband Coalition that Jim Ballard had a role in putting together. And Scott and I, again, we've synced repeatedly on this topic of broadband mapping and data. And I know he's a bit of a contrarian no matter what he says, but that's why we like him so much. And thank you for being with us and giving your perspective, because you've done a lot. You've drilled into this too, Scott. And so we look forward to hearing what TPI is thinking on broadband mapping. And then batting cleanup will be Dustin Loop. Dustin has really come into a very significant role. He is an expert on internet governance and policy and program manager for the Marconi Society's National Broadband Mapping Coalition. This coalition has, exploded from like 40 to 160 in the last couple of months because there's so much interest in broadband mapping and data and understanding it. And so the Broadband Mapping Coalition that he runs has been meeting every month, and I'm sure more often he can tell us about that, but he can also bring his own perspectives and thoughts on this question and the controversies that we're currently seeing here. So like I said, so much to unpack here. We won't get through it, but we're going to give it a try. And with that, let's turn it over to Brian, who I understand has a presentation that you want to share with us. So Brian, go for it.
Thank you, Drew. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to walk through just some images to help everybody understand a little bit about how many states are actually utilizing crowdsourced mapping, crowdsourced data in order to better map where broadband is and is not. One of the really important things is that location data, the precision of location data, plays a huge part in being able to define something better than, well, this general area does or does not have broadband. It really needs to be very precise. If on this side of the road, we've determined that there is broadband, and on this side, there is not. This is where we need to concentrate. And you've really got to have, very precise data to be able to do that. We capture that from mobile devices. And this is true whether they're connected to a mobile network or whether they're connected to a fixed network via Wi-Fi. This allows us to see, who the ISP is in either case, and be able to capture a solid latitude and longitude associated with where the test was taken and who it was taken on. And just to give you an idea how different that looks, when I say general area, often tests that are taken through a browser, and this is on our platform or anyone else's, is really going to roll up to about a zip code level. So this is the large areas that you're seeing. When you can precisely pinpoint where these locations are, where these tests took place, then you can see much more clearly where your efforts need to be. It needs to be this level of granularity. There are some concerns about crowdsourced data. Why do people run a speed test? And I think this again is true, whether we're talking about Ookla's speed test or any of the other network performance platforms out there. And sometimes it is because they're trying to diagnose a problem. I've got a slow connection, what's going on? They've made an investment, if they've increased their plan with their ISP, if they've bought a new Wi-Fi router or phone or laptop, and just sometimes preparation. I've got an important Zoom call coming up. Is my internet behaving like I need it to? But often when people think they have a slow connection, it is actually the platform that they're trying to access. So sometimes we see very, very good speeds when people think that they've got a problem, but in fact, it's an issue with Facebook or Netflix. Their gaming platform is being sluggish. So we see a wide variety of tests. So these are some northern suburbs from Denver, and wanted to kind of build from the ground up. So Denver's covered up with a lot of telecommunications companies, lots of fiber, lots of cable. But here are tests captured in these northern suburbs that show very poor speeds, less than 25 megabits per second. And the darker you see the color, the slower it is. Then we're going to put on top of that all the tests we've captured from the same area that are between 25 and 100 to 300 megabits per second. We're tiering this and we're stacking them on top because we're trying to ask a different question, which is what's available in an area as opposed to what people are actually subscribing to. as well as what they may be experiencing temporarily. So this can help correct for some of those issues that people sometimes complain about with crowdsourced service. We are seeing a full range of experiences. And here, as we've rolled out the tests that are north of 300 megabits per second, obviously most of this area has very, very good connectivity. It's suburban, you would expect it to, yet you've got areas even in this metropolitan Denver area that clearly need to be investigated. Why are we seeing these pockets where people are having trouble connecting? So now I want to take this to another part of the state and talk a little bit about Form 477 data. We've all been for the last year and a half or more, operating on this December 2020 data that was last released, and we're looking at an area in Colorado Springs and Black Forest, and this is the Dsl footprint for Centurylink, reported December 2020. We're going to lay the fiber on top of that. This is what they reported in their forms as where they offer fiber. But when we lay speed tests on top of that, clearly some of this matches up quite well with where they've been investing in their network, but other areas do not. And you can see these sort of jump out. These aren't the only ones on the map, but these are the ones that are clearly large areas, significant number of tests. Many of these dots you see on the map, by the way, represent multiple tests. They're stacked on top of one another. And so where you're seeing scores of tests coming back, people interested in their speed, concerned about their speed, yet in the 12 months following the report, so we're looking at 2021 data compared with 2020, December 2020, Form 477, clearly there's questions to be asked here. Why aren't these people, why is no one here seeing an increase in speed? We don't see 100% adoption right away. We don't expect all the red dots to turn green or blue, but you would expect to see something. The other thing that we want to mention as well, there's an opportunity, and I had an op-ed in Broadband Breakfast a couple of weeks ago about wireless, and there is an opportunity with all this middle mile fiber going out to also improve wireless connectivity. And so this is actual real world readings that we're getting from devices that are traveling around as anonymously collected. And you can see the red areas, think of that as one bar, bit of an oversimplification. The blue areas are going to be very strong signals. And then we have even captured approximate tower locations. And you can see that you don't have to get very far outside of a major city like Providence, Rhode Island, in this example, to run into some really difficult coverage areas. And this Verizon is shown as an example, but you would see very similar images for the other operators in the area. And wireless can do things that fixed cannot. Public safety response, precision agriculture, telehealth in these mobile devices, as well as economic development in these areas. And so just wanted to make these points that there is a wonderful opportunity here to actually plan this out as these middle mile fiber routes are being built to attract tower companies and wireless operators. Let me hand this back over to Drew.
Well, thank you very much for laying that out. And I when I had the chance to see this, I say, we got to feature this, because this is exactly what is needed by you, by Ookla, and by many others, which is to say actual data, real life tests, just downloads, right? We can't even talk about uploads, right? Against the alleged or the claimed or the Form 477. So with that backdrop, let's turn it over to Scott Walston. Tell us a little bit about TPI and your interest in broadband mapping and some of your thoughts about the current train wreck that is the FCC's broadband mapping process.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me. I've been on Broadband Breakfast before. It's always great to be here, and also great to talk with you. Like you said, we've been working on broadband data issues together for a long time, which I think also goes to showing the point of how difficult this issue is and how it always changes. TPI is a think tank. We are all economists. We do mostly empirical work. For the mapping process, we've built a platform focused on data analytics, and which can do all kinds of cool things behind the scenes. And we imagine being involved in the availability challenge process in our ability to combine lots of data sets. But so let me let me make a few points. So first, before I go into any criticisms, I want to say that even if it is a train wreck, the FCC is doing a great job. I mean, they were handed a very difficult task by Congress, which defined what they had to do. And by all indications, they're working extremely hard. And so I want people to understand that my criticisms are not of the FCC staff, who I think are really amazing and could not be working any harder on this. Okay, that said, 4 points. First, we will never get to a perfect 100% accurate map. It's impossible, and it's the wrong standard to use. Second, we shouldn't even think of it as a map. I think that has caused people to think of it in terms of false precision. It's data, and data is always measured with error and is always changing. A map is a visualization of the data. Now, understanding that error can help make better decisions. Brian just talked about some of the bias in the speed test data from selection effects, but because he talked about it, it helps us understand and better interpret the data. And that's the kind of thing we need to do. Moreover, a lot of it's probabilistic. So with the wireless data that Brian showed, at what point do you consider an area to not be covered? Or can you think of it as, the likelihood that an area is covered? And so, once you start thinking about it that way, it opens up more possibilities. And then the third is, no one data set is going to have all the information. The best information comes from combining data sets and identifying where they agree and disagree. And really, that's the challenge process, is trying to incorporate all that information into one platform. Fourth, the more transparent the process is, the better. And as far as I can tell, at the moment with the Fabric challenge, there is not a lot of transparency. I don't believe third parties are allowed to access the Fabric. And that's a mistake. The FCC has paid CostQuest $45 million to build this, and everybody should be able to take a look at it and see, have input into what's right and wrong. I should point out that, of course, just in addition to loving to work with data, like I said, we do plan on being involved in it. So, of course, we have an interest in it being transparent. But I know that's something Dustin will talk about. He's been involved in a lot more of it. Now, let me expand just a bit. We still are in this mode of thinking that we can count everything and identify everything perfectly. And this is incorrect. This stems from what the US Census used to do, what they call the census of telephones and telegraph. Ooh, with my background, you're not going to be able to see it. This is my low-tech slide. But they started in 1896 doing census of telephones and telegraphs, counting every single line. And we still do that. But in every other area of the economy, we don't do that anymore. Counts are more inaccurate than other methods like surveys. And BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and Bureau of Labor Statistics collect all kinds of economic data using very sophisticated surveys. Nobody does it better than them. We just don't rely on a census to think that we've counted everything. Even Drew had changed the name of Broadband Census. I don't know if that was the reason, but it's certainly consistent with this. Even if you think about a map, and just think about maps you use, and that they can't perfectly represent reality. We all use Google Maps and other maps, Apple Maps for driving, and they're amazing. They take billions of pieces of information, but everyone knows that it'll still try and force you to make that terrible left turn, even though it shouldn't. It's just that maps are collections of data and they have error. And so we need to be thinking about this as a process of collecting and analyzing the data, and to take information from as many sources as possible. A key implication here is that states should absolutely embrace the FCC map as the foundation for its funding decisions. I mean, they want to be actively involved in the challenge process, but the FCC map, it will have error at the end. But that should be your foundation, and you build onto that and combine other things with it. Criticisms of the map saying that it has problems, like I'm making, doesn't mean that something else by itself is inherently better, but you combine it with things. Now, a final point is to remember that maps are political. All maps are political, and there are incentives other than a quest for truth driving the data. The biggest one here, of course, is money. Now, the only required use of the FCC map is to allocate the BEAD funds. And that's going to be determined by the state's share of the country's total unserved areas. So that means the state has an interest in declaring as much area as possible unserved. Each additional percentage point you have of the unserved areas is worth maybe $400 million more to the state. So, that could create a big race to the bottom when every state wants to show that it is entirely unserved. I made this point in another place, and Gary Bolton, the head of FBA, pointed out that ISPs have other incentives. They don't want to be overbuilt. So there are checks and balances in this. So, we're not going to end up with a challenge where states are saying they have no coverage. But these are other incentives going away. So, I guess in short, don't pretend that 100% accuracy is possible. Don't judge the map by that. But think about how to reduce the error and incorporate all types of data, including speed tests. Brian's data is amazing, and everything else we can find. And try to think of it as data and data analysis, not just pictures.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for that great overview, that great perspective, Scott. Let's go ahead and turn it right over now to Dustin to tell us more about the Broadband Mapping Coalition and, I guess maybe just the current controversies that you find yourself in, and how should we, what are the first principles, right? What do we need to kind of go back to and remember and think of as we consider this problem set, Dustin?
Yeah, Drew, thanks for that. And really, really appreciated Brian and Scott teeing this up really well with a lot of great points. So just to start, for those of you that may not be familiar, the National Broadband Mapping Coalition is a group of experts that have focused on broadband data collection and network performance measurements for quite some time. It's as well as those that are just getting into this. It includes researchers, practitioners, vendors and consultants, local, state, and federal leaders that are trying to figure this stuff out, and a lot of folks in between. So it is open to anyone who wants to work and contribute to these discussions around how we get the best open, transparent methodologies and data in place for these decisions that we make. So you can go to broadbandmappingcoalition.org if you'd like to join these conversations. But I want to build on, I think, particularly use Scott's point about the best method being bringing together and utilizing many different data sets, because no particular data set is perfect for everything. There are limitations of every data set. There will be some inaccuracies or just limits to the precision of that data. But right now, just operating from what's happening at the FCC, we do have a single entity in the FCC creating a national map that is going to be built on a fabric layer of each location that can be served with broadband, that's being built by one entity, granted pulling together different data sets, but one entity in CostQuest. And the availability data to start with is really primarily built on self-reported data from providers. And as Scott mentioned, there may be some incentives there to represent generously where they do and don't provide service, just as states may have differing incentives there. And so there are mechanisms in these new FCC national broadband availability maps to address the reliance on a single map. And those mechanisms fall into three categories that are different from the previous FCC Form 477 process. One is that governmental entities and hopefully eventually third parties will be able to file verified data into the broadband data collection portal that can be compared against what the providers are reporting. There's also a separate challenge process. And there are actually two challenge processes, one focused specifically on the base layer of the map, which identifies each individual location across the country and whether or not that structure is deemed to be a serviceable location. And then there is the challenge process for availability data, which also kind of branches out into fixed availability data, which we'll mostly talk about today. And that's the map that will be used in the BEAD program. And then there's also mobile availability data as well. Each of these challenge processes will also then further branch out into bulk challenge processes and individual consumer challenge processes as well. And then beyond that, there's a third mechanism to report crowdsourced data into these broadband maps that can be incorporated and potentially used as a method of verification for the data that is provided by the ISPs. And so it's great to see that these mechanisms are in place, but there are some inherent limitations that are built into these processes. One is that the challenge process, which has been a major focus. There's been a lot of discussion. I'm sure, as we all have heard, different states and communities have been gearing up to think about how they can successfully challenge the data that will be released in these new public maps in November, based on previous issues with the maps that we've seen that have limited the ability to access federal funding. And so in the challenge process, it's worth recognizing that the specs for the fixed availability challenge process and the crowdsourced data reporting were released last week by the FCC. And they made it clear that the challenge process will not be used to verify whether or not the actual speeds of a plan are comparable to the advertised speeds of the plan. So the challenge process will not be used. It will only be used to verify whether or not the plan can be purchased, not whether it actually delivers the speeds listed in its advertisements and on its plan.
Wow.
So with that, there are lists of possible methodologies that communities, states, and others can use to challenge the availability data. And those fall basically into two categories. One is the knowledge of infrastructure, so knowing where things are built and whether or not the infrastructure is actually there to provide the plans that are being reported, and then data collected from the individual consumers. And so with that, it's worth noting that there's also some language in the spec that limits the ability of the governmental entities or any bulk challenge filers from mass collection of ISP advertisements, because to launch a challenge process based on the data collected from ISPs, someone must certify that they are a resident, owner, or otherwise authorized to purchase broadband at that location. So the ability to gather that and use it in a challenge process at scale is severely limited by that, and will require basically individual responses to collect data and submit it to the state. And so we do have a challenge process in place. However, it is very limited, I think, in how well that can be used to actually contribute and improve the quality of the national maps at any scale. And so that has kind of been redirected into the crowdsourced process, which does allow for speed test data to be submitted, does allow that data to be submitted in a way that tries to highlight discrepancies between actual and advertised speeds. And it also allows those submissions to be more gathered at scale. So it does not require the certification that you're authorized to purchase broadband at the location that you're providing the ISP data from. Although if you read through some of the terms of use and acceptable use policies of ISP websites, they may, and I'm not a lawyer, but there is some language in there that might restrict their ability to do so. So I think the way that these things have been structured really limits the ways in which these data sets can be pulled together. And so that really then points us to what needs to be done for the proper allocation of BEAD funds. And I know, Scott, that you pointed to the initial allocation and the incentives that states have to ensure that they get a fair slice of the pie, or maximize the dollars coming to the state. But then once those allocations are announced, they do have to submit an initial proposal that has their own state level challenge process. And so the way that we're looking at this in the coalition is that given the limitations of the ability to, I think, effectively and efficiently participate in FCC's challenge process, that the BEAD challenge process at the state level across all of the states will be really a critical component of ensuring that the BEAD funds get to the locations that they need to actually serve the unserved and underserved folks. And so,
okay, Justin, let's broaden this out a little bit. Okay, so we've basically had three people laying out the news, and in some ways, Dustin, I was thinking to myself as you were talking, so when do I get to shoot the messenger, Dustin? I mean, like, this is like terrible news, and like I think it's important to like really get to the bottom of where it is and whether it truly is as bad as you say, Dustin. Again, I just the trust but verify part of me coming out, but I want to kind of just broaden out the discussion just a little bit more here, okay? And one of the reasons why we're doing this broadband mapping masterclass next Tuesday at 12 noon is because there are so many areas, so many interrelated areas, and we're going to kind of walk through those bit by bit next week. But for now, I put into the chat window for those of you who are watching via Zoom, and I like to point out, because we have many people watching outside of Zoom on other platforms, there are at least 4 ways. This is my own kind of thinking on this topic, at least 4 ways or reasons why people conduct or talk about or think about broadband maps. One is just to kind of put a directory out there, right? So like, hey, would you like to buy service from me, right? And I mentioned this as kind of providers like cable companies want to offer broadband services, but aren't so interested in USF subsidies. That's changed, as a commenter pointed out, because of BEAD, because of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. A second reason for doing broadband mapping, and this has pretty much driven most of the conversation over the last 2 or 3 years, rural telecommunications and wireless providers recognize the importance of government mapping out areas and really addresses, homes, parcel by parcel, that are served and unserved. So we can literally identify those that don't have 25 by 3 or 100 by 20 broadband and subsidize it, right? A third key piece that I always want to come back to, we're not going to talk a lot about it here, but new entrants who want to bring high capacity fiber need to be able to kind of hook into location points, right? And so that's a very important part of broadband mapping that is sometimes under the surface, but we need to remember that too, particularly if we're trying to incent competition and kind of new building, right? I want to avoid the dreaded overbuilding term, but that's a really important part of broadband mapping. And then the last one, and this is so appropriate because we've just come from, or at least several of us have come from TPRC, the Telecommunications Policy Research Conference. And the total theme of that this past weekend, Friday and Saturday, was measuring broadband speeds and the broadband labels that the FCC has working on a docket, which is to say, how do you verify what the actual speeds are that people are offering? So with that bit of a background, let's focus our discussion among the four of us here on two key questions. How are challenges going to be realized, right? And whether or not the FCC is not going to allow it, like how can we really get at this point that Brian showed us, where you identified concrete evidence that there is not 25/3 broadband in areas that are claimed as served by as a fiber service. I mean, it's just, again, it's like the evidence is clear, and how are we going to get that evidence, and who needs to see that evidence, I guess. So that's one question I want everyone's take on. And the second is, what's your sense of the dynamic that will emerge between states and the federal government? Because I think this is where there's really the most opportunity and creativity, because states are already eagle-eyed, as several have said already. States will have an incentive to challenge the FCC's data. And so you kind of have a little bit of a point where maybe states want to show more unserved and underserved. Carriers don't necessarily want to show that, but the states do. So how is this going to play out? So those two big macro questions, let's hear all three of your thoughts on them. Let's start with you, Brian.
Thank you, Drew. Your two questions may have a similar answer to them, in that I really believe that what we're seeing coming out of the FCC and what's going on at NTIA, although they ultimately both serve distributing these BEAD funds out where they're needed, I think the FCC map serves a different basic purpose. This understanding where the operators, where the ISPs claim a particular level of service in and of itself is an important bedrock to the map. They have to make a claim and say, this is what we have here, or this is what we believe we have here. And keep in mind that before, as Form 477 was rolled out, you had over 11 million census blocks that everybody was trying to fill, right? With, we've got this here and that there. Now we've got so many more as we're looking to count every single service address in the country. Scott mentioned before that the folks at the staff at the FCC, they've got a gargantuan task in front of them. You've got to respect the fact that they've been handed an extraordinarily difficult task. On the other hand, once this baseline is set, NTIA and the states are going to have some flexibility. I think they're going to have quite a bit of flexibility in ultimately determining what areas need to be assisted with these broadband funds. But the FCC map will create the baseline and a substantial understanding of where this does and does not exist. And then the arguments can go over the areas where there's disagreement.
Okay, so what you're saying is there will be opportunity to challenge after the FCC is a key part of what you just said, right, Ryan?
Yes, I think so. And these are two different issues. If you've got an ISP that claims to have a service in a given area, then there does need to be, and you have an individual that wants to challenge that. I live here. They claim they serve me with this level. Either I can't get service, or they want to charge me a great deal of money to get service, or the service that I'm getting doesn't meet the criteria that has been claimed. And so, understanding that as a layer in the map, where the ISP doesn't necessarily change what they have claimed based upon non-specific evidence, okay, is one approach to this, or creates that underlying map. But then you will have the disagreements where you've got overwhelming evidence otherwise. And that's where the crowdsourcing data is going to help inform not only the FCC to be able to question the ISPs themselves, but also NTIA and the states as they start being very specific about where these funds are being targeted.
Scott, what's your take on this? How is the rubber going to meet the road here when we've got evidence that shows areas are not being served at the areas they're promised?
I think there's going to be significant disagreements on what constitutes evidence. In my opinion, the agency should err on the side of inclusion, because the more information you put together, the better, as long as you understand how the data were collected. And I think that allowing input from lots and lots of different data sets and types of data will also address the trust issue that somebody wrote about in the chat. People don't trust the FCC maps, I think was the question, how to restore it. The more information you can put into a map, the more likely it is that people will believe the final outcome if it's all transparent and explained. And another advantage of doing that is that it can actually make things much more efficient for states. There's so much data available. If they take the FCC, part of this is the challenge, and then the second part, they use it to decide where to target. States can use this information to identify places where there's the most uncertainty. You might find areas where speed test says everything's perfect, the providers say everything's perfect, and Microsoft says, and so you don't need to worry about that. And then there might be areas where one data set says one thing, another data set says another, and the state can put resources into investigating that area in whatever is the right way. Maybe if it's an adoption issue, you focus on surveys. If it's availability, you send someone out there to do something more. But so it will help focus on areas where there are the biggest questions. So I've not answered your question. But
well, let's just get so specific. Where is this data going to live? I mean, is there place in any database that the federal government or any federal government agency has compiled for there to be what we talked about 14 years ago, Scott, which is like a living repository of broadband data that will enable crowdsourced data to flow into it, right? Is that on the cards or not? And I'd love Scott and Dustin's thought on that right now.
Well, I don't know whether nobody seems to be able to do that specifically. That's one of the reasons we built our platform. We wanted a place where we could put all the data together, and there would be ways for people to merge it together easily, because data comes from all kinds of places you may or may not expect. I would like to be providing it as a public good, and I think the government should, but it's got to be something like that. I don't think it's realistic to think that there will be, one official place where all the data exists. But you've got to be able to know how to combine it and use it. People often talk about, libraries and things, but those are just unmanageable. So I don't know the answer to how, we continuously maintain a certain set of data, but we need mechanisms to combine them and validate them and test them against each other. And I think to do that, again, requires lots and lots of transparency to know exactly how everything's done.
Dustin, could you speak to that as well as the transparency point that Scott has raised?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with what's been said about the difficulty and just finding that one repository of all of this information. Even with crowdsourcing mechanisms in place, it's going to be difficult for that to occur at the FCC with their broadband data collection program. So whatever we can do to make these different data sets more compatible is a benefit for the process and the tools that Scott is talking about, to pull in a bunch of different data sets to get a better understanding, even if it's building on an understanding of potential trends and potential areas of contestation. And so want to really hit home on that, the need for the transparency in this process. And that falls into a couple of different places. One, the fabric data. Right now, this fabric data of all the locations that was created by CostQuest has a lot of issues around what they've been allowed to write into their license agreement for how this data can actually be used. And so
let's talk specifically about that. And again, we have had folks from CostQuest programs in the past. We don't have them here right now. I don't know if they're in the audience, but could we speak to what does this mean? What does this restriction on the fabric's public availability mean? How can anyone be able to verify and check if the data is not at least some level of it publicly available or referenceable, right? Did you have any thoughts on that, Scott and Dustin and Brian, if you've been following this too?
Yeah, so what we've been hearing and seeing around these license agreements for those entities that have had access to them so far is that the licenses that are used to gain access to the fabric essentially say that you can use the fabric for reporting into the broadband data collection program and for challenging the accuracy of the fabric, but is very restrictive on how you can use it beyond that and how you can share it, and as well as the access of third parties and individuals to that data to themselves verify it. And so what we're seeing here is basically the burden falling onto ISPs and governmental entities to take this data, process it, and then figure out how they go about challenging, correcting it, analyzing it, and are very limited in their ability to crowdsource that out or to work with third parties that are working at an aggregate level. And then through this process that requires a lot of resources that a lot of local communities are really struggling to pull together, they are kind of required to help build CostQuest database for them. But then if they want to turn around and use it for other means in a more open way, that requires an additional license to be purchased by that community that's helping to build that database, therefore kind of creating this loop of public funds that are being used to build a database that is not open or transparent. And so that's a big concern on our end right now, and would love Scott's.
Yeah, we want to get to some of the questions. We've got a lot of great questions, but Scott and Brian, could you just both weigh in on this point about the CostQuest non-publicly available fabric?
We've certainly heard from some folks that there are some fairly significant differences in the number of service addresses. This can affect the math on how much dollars are going to go to one state or another. Most of what we've heard are in high growth areas. You've got to appreciate the fact that this is constantly moving, right? And this is a constantly, all the data that we're trying to work on, including the speed test data, even the old Form 477 data, it was always changing as this took place. And so this in and of itself is a challenge, is that we're sort of trying to change the tire on the car as it's driving down the highway. And that has complicated, this larger effort of trying to ultimately define what the math is and divide up who gets how, who gets what portion of these funds. Scott?
Yes. So, the more groups that you exclude, the less information you have. And, it's hard to think of a legitimate reason for excluding third parties from the fabric at this point. Now, once we get to availability, then, companies and other ISPs, co-ops, they've submitted data that's under the promise that it's proprietary. And then you understand there'll be a need to aggregate it in certain ways. And I'm sure that there will be some serious discussions about that. Then there will still need to be something public. But at this point, we're talking about the fabric and what's identified as broadband serviceable locations. And groups might want to just learn how to use the fabric, how to work with it. Not possible. And Dustin mentioned small providers. There are lots of very small providers, WISPs and others, who they have enough people working for them to maintain their system. They are not there to evaluate a data set, and they in principle may want somebody to help them with it. Their trade association may be able to help them with it. I don't know for sure whether trade associations are considered third parties or not, but it's creating a problem. And maybe I'm wrong, but the only things I can find in the FCC before the contract was made was that it would all be public. And now suddenly it isn't. And that is just going to lead to worse information.
Well, we'll have to do a follow-up and have CostQuest here to talk about it. Let's go to some of these questions we've got. There've been so many here. In some ways, I'm almost tempted to start from more or less the bottom here. Daniel Smith asks, which states are leading in accessing and exploiting the fabric? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I will say that there's been a lot of discussion about states and the role states play, both on themselves and with contractors and Lightbox, as it was one example. States are basically now, as I stated earlier, have a reverse incentive than they did the last time we did broadband mapping. And I know because I worked as the broadband director of the state of Illinois, that we worked very collaboratively with the NTIA and the FCC because we were all on the same team. We were providing the data that got then checked and then uploaded into the FCC's National Broadband Map. Now the FCC has the task by themselves to do this, and the states are kind of in an adversarial position. And quite frankly, this may be a better result because I think having one entity checking another is going to at least have the best hope we have for truth checking claims. But anyway, what are the thoughts the panelists have on what states you believe are leading in accessing and exploiting the fabric? Any thoughts?
What we're working with states on is primarily the crowdsourced data. So exactly what they're doing, on the fabric itself, we don't have a whole lot of visibility to. What there's no question about, though, is that states are at varying levels of readiness associated with this entire process. And the states that are significantly behind are going to find it very difficult, I think, to catch up. And they need to, and they're having the same hiring issues that everybody else is.
Right.
We've heard that from many of them as well. They're trying to get staffed up to work on this and participate.
Okay, Robert C. asks, and this is a great question. Robert has been involved with, maybe still is, the USDA. Thank you for being on the event and so many events, Robert. What about housing the broadband maps and verification analysis at the Center of Mapping Expertise for the U.S., the U.S. Geological Survey? They have mapping expertise, geographic mapping, and are removed from the political policy challenges. That's a great idea. Thoughts?
I think the idea of having the data collected by disinterested third parties, other agencies, is a great one. I don't think that needs to be done at the FCC at all. Have BEA and BLS get involved. Obviously, they would need more resources to do it because everybody wants them to collect data on their thing. But there's no reason. It's only at the FCC for historical reasons. It doesn't have to be. Other agencies have expertise in particular areas. In this case, the USGS for mapping. So, in general, I think it's a great idea.
John Rowe asks, doesn't the CBRS, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service Spectrum Access System, the SAS, demonstrate a big step towards the FCC bringing its technology to map broadband out of ancient times? Does anyone have experience with CBRS and wireless?
I don't want to dominate, but I do have some thoughts on this.
Go for it.
But it's a more general point that we've already done lots of work to identify areas that don't have service, and we should be taking those into account. This is one of them. RDOF is actually another. All of the areas that RDOF identified as unserved. Now we know there are problems with it, but it's a pretty good start at identifying geographic areas that were unserved. And I don't know whether CostQuest is taking that into account at the moment, but we should. That was a lot of work that was done in both of these cases, and we should incorporate it. It's just additional data.
Daniel Smith says, big role for community activism. Equity funds will be very helpful. Let's ask Dustin this point, because I know you've worked with community groups on this, and you've also been quite involved in digital equity. So tell us a little bit about your thought on this question.
Yeah, so I agree that this is a really important role for communities to play in building this information from the ground up and getting some ground truth. I think we all know that at the community level, you know, they know best what is actually available to them. There's just an issue in kind of funneling that data up to additional layers and incorporating it in a compatible way. And I actually think this in many ways goes back to the state process for the BEAD planning, because that designing a transparent, evidence-based, streamlined challenge process for the BEAD program that allows communities to use that ground truth to make the case for the funding that they need is an opportunity to mobilize those communities in a way that helps them advocate for themselves, but also builds a better state level database. And hopefully that translates into a better national database. And then also want to keep in mind here that the states, in parallel to planning for the BEAD funding, will be having digital equity planning processes that will be overlapping with the 5-year plans for BEAD, as well as the proposals that they submit. And so there's also this opportunity to get these data sets working together in a way that goes beyond just right now we're really only talking about download and upload speed, right? So what about affordability, right, different metrics of performance, reliability, and like getting back to what Brian touched on at the beginning, how do we start to think about the total capacity that a community needs for residences, public safety, community anchor institutions, schools, wireless providers, wireline providers, and getting a holistic understanding. And that requires really getting these different data sets to work together. And that's just not happening at the federal level.
Drew, can I add to that, please?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's some really important points that Dustin touched on there. Of course, I mentioned wireless. Part of the reason that we're concerned about that is that there's a certain portion of the population that almost doesn't sit still long enough in order to be able to get a terrestrial connection. They've got housing insecurity. You've got people that don't have IDs that are not going to apply for a federal program like the Affordable Connectivity Program. And when you've got areas and where you might have disagreements with where the ISPs are reporting and claiming service and the experiences that we're seeing on speed test, if you've got an area that is being said, this absolutely has connectivity that meets those broadband connections minimums, yet you're not seeing the experiences there, that might be an indication that you've got a serious affordability problem there. And so looking at this data as informing both sides of this equation, you've got not only accessibility, but you've got affordability that are going to impact families being able to participate in today's digital economy. And I think that's what the goal is to make sure that not only is it there, but people have the ability to use it.
So we've got a question from Mike Dunn, multiple questions, but we're going to have to make this our last. And I'm sorry, we've gotten so many. We will come back to as many of these as we can when we come back more fully to this in the masterclass. So I encourage you all to register for that. This is Mike Dunn's question. I'd love each of your take on this and any other final thoughts you have. Basically, how will the NTIA reconcile the outcomes of two separate challenge processes, challenges to the initial revised maps, November-ish is when we're kind of expecting them, and the state level challenge process that must be integral to the state's sub-grant processes for BEAD funds? Let's go in the order we started with, Brian, Scott, and Dustin.
Well, in some of the conversations we have had with NTIA, they do plan on having crowdsourcing be a significant informer of where those disagreements need to be settled.
Okay, Scott.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to it, but they are going to have to figure out ways of incorporating all this data. And Brian mentioned that there were different aspects of data that mean different things. And there's the providers are sending in availability data, things like speed tests. I think somebody wrote this in the comments somewhere. That shows an intersection of availability and supply and demand. And so you want to think about what each of them are, but they are going to have to figure out ways of incorporating all of the data together. And like I said, I think they can use it to identify areas where there's uncertainty and then put more effort into trying to find what's going on there.
Justin, you get the last few words.
Yeah, I mean, I think just there's the two. I don't think they necessarily need to reconcile that, because one will be used for the initial state distribution and then the other will be used for the sub grants.
Good point.
And so I think it's better focused on figuring out the best method for figuring out that challenge level at the states that can be based on, an evidence-based, transparent methodology that hopefully is aligned across as many states as possible, that makes NTIA's job a lot easier in reviewing all of those challenge outcomes and contributes to a better cross-state and national outcome and understanding from all of these challenges that we're going to see at the state level.
Well, that will have to be our last word. Don't forget, next Tuesday, 12 to 2, a 2-hour Broadband Masking Masterclass. Register and sign up for that if you are interested in going deep into this issue. Next Wednesday, the 28th, we'll be back. We'll be talking about asset valuations for IIJA projects. On behalf of our great panelists, Brian Darr, Scott Walston, and Dustin Loop, I'm Drew Clark of Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Thanks, Drew.